I think one of the problems we face today in today's world, we're coming to like a new world system, and there's so much understanding and forgiveness for people that are not doing so well. Like the Islamic world, let's go study the countries, let's go learn Islam, let's find out why they behave the way they do, why do they have dictatorships, and why are their policies towards women so oppressive, and this and that. Let's be kind, because maybe we're wrong, maybe we're missing something. We're all human after all, but we don't have that about the West, because the West is rich and powerful, and the West has had all the leading, innovations in science and progress and technology. So a lot of times we don't understand why white Western countries, white led majority countries, do the things they do. And I think we're very hard on them. And as far as what Canada's going through, as far as them, honoring Mr. Hunka, I think he was a colonel in the Nazi, one of the Nazi units. That was Ukrainian, not German. He is a Ukrainian, but they allied with the Nazis for whatever those reasons were. You can look it up historically. But I think what happens is we don't understand the West. Let me give you a quick rundown on how this all happened. Europe has gone through an experimental, extremely, you can call it rebellion against old institutions. And experimental in the sense they're always willing to try something new, and that's how they've made it. They've broken away from old ideas and started accepting new ideas. Some of those look a little wild and crazy for a lot of us around the world, like these gender ideas. Even though those gender ideas are normal, for example, in Hindu India and in Buddhist Southeast Asia and China, like, this non-binary understanding of sexuality, they've always had that. But okay, we're going through some kind of great change in idea. But this is what happened. In Western Europe, especially in Germany, they broke away from the Vatican. The Vatican had always been the church that ruled everything west of Greece, pretty much. And that was the way it was. There was 5 sees. They were called 5 different sections. And that was the way the world was. And they rebelled against that church. And then England joined up and made their own church. And the Germans made a church called the Lutheran Church, following a guy called Martin Luther. You should look it up. And after that, this expanse of thought began, and they started going and trying to do new things in new ways all around the world. They believed they were Christian. They believed that they had some kind of right to bring about a Christian way in the world that wasn't the Vatican's way. And they settled the United States, they settled Canada, and began the great new expanse of European reach. And they didn't go into the Islamic world and take over and colonize. For a little while they did, and then they left. And it's been hard, I think, for Muslims to accept that that's the way it is. But now, part of that experimentation and that whole expanse of idea and thought and philosophy and ideology and new ways of looking at old things, and sometimes old ways of looking at new things, one of the things was that they went through a lot of experimental governmental forms. And this has just happened in the last 100 and some odd years. We've just recently started experimenting. And it all began, and there was 3 major revolutions that took place. One was the American one, the other was the French, and the last was the Russian Revolution. And during this period of time, there's been new ways of trying to understand how can you govern, how can you rule. Now, the leading countries in the world have these experimental models. Now, if you have somebody, to understand Nazism, let me explain Nazism to you. What happened was, every place there was an experimental model moving away from church and moving away from religion. They started trying to find out what were the core problems or reasons in each one. Now, every time they departed from spirituality and religion, they started going towards race. And Germany, unfortunately, fell to only thinking about race. And their idea was, even though Jews were Germans, and they had been Germans for hundreds and hundreds, as a matter of fact, India, they say, well, the Mughals only ruled for 700 years. And, there wasn't that many Muslims otherwise. That's how long Jews had been in Germany. And they were German. They ate German. They spoke German. They lived German. Many people spoke another dialect, something called Yiddish. Some people very rarely learned Hebrew in Hebrew school, similar to how you have religious school in many other religions, and so on and so forth. But they went into a race ideology, and their race ideology separated them from the Jews. They said the only difference between us and them is that they didn't say we are Christian and they are Jewish, which is what they should have done. But because they were trying to abandon faith, they said they are Afro-Asiatic and we are Semitic. And this whole, because at that time linguistic groups were being studied at the same time, and they were finding out that there was a difference between one linguistic group and another. And based on that, and we found linguistic groups have a lot of overlap, especially Indo-European and Celtic and all this. You find out that it's not that clear cut. Race and linguistic groups make race. You make race eventually. You know, everything is, race isn't just made. Race is made by intermarrying and then staying in the gene pool and then intermarrying again and keeping the gene pool more or less homogeneous. That's what makes a similar race. They decided for just 20 years, poor guys, just 20 years, part of the experimental model, they went into this thing called National Socialism. And National Socialism, unfortunately, ended and became all about obliterating and killing off all Jews, as they're the problem in the world. And they use religious references that because God keeps exhorting them to do better for themselves, and that every time they do something wrong, a prophet would come and slap them on the wrist or tell them something horrible will happen to you if you don't take heed. So they felt like these are the bad children of God, and so on and so forth. And this idea took on another level. And that kind of thing doesn't really, if you really open up the holy books, you're not going to really find a curse or any kind of collective guilt like that. There's nothing like that. You can draw from it and make up your own story, but the truth is there is no collective guilt. There's no curse. We've tried to find the curse. I've had many years to read the Bible. There's no place where it straight up says you will have a curse. There's always a place where it says if you do this, you will be banished and you won't be able to return. But then they returned. And then later on it says, again, this might happen to you if you don't do this or that. But then there's another event. And, you know, that's why Christianity is different than Judaism. Now, for 20 years there, a lot of people, the problem is, and the philosophical debate exists, when a dictatorship takes over, do you partake with the dictatorship or do you stand by yourself? And if you have no choice to stand by yourself, like if they come and do a census at your home and say, if you don't stand by, what was his name? Adolf Hitler, they used to call him the Führer. Like if you don't stand by their Führer, then you're going to go to jail. So a lot of people would be like, yeah, we're with the Führer, no problem, you know, and they do the little salute and stuff. Now, a lot of people were just laymen, and they had to salute Hitler. And a lot of people, even in parties, were from prominent positions in society, and they didn't want to lose that, so they had to nod their head to the system. But they weren't Nazis in the sense that a lot of them snuck Jews out of there, saved Jews' lives, because they were like, this is hopefully going to pass. Hopefully this is a really dirty part of our history that we're going through something so desperate and crazy just because of a little bit of difficulty and austerity. They didn't know. But 20 years is a whole generation. And if you see sudden poverty for a whole generation, of course you're going to do crazy things. So when the war ended, a lot of these people were now just Germans again. Now, before Hitler and Nazism, there were Germans. And after them, after they came and left with those symbols and their ideology and the occult things that were being taught to the people, there were still Germans. They're people. There were people before and there were people after. There were Germans that came and migrated and did a great service to the United States, for example, and then later to Canada. There's Germans that stayed quiet during the movement that occurred during World War II, and there's Germans that'll always be coming afterwards as well. There's Germans that might have come into Canada or the United States yesterday as new immigrants, and they're excited for the opportunities. They watch YouTube just like you guys. They learn about the world. They say, oh, Canada's kind of cold, but it's this interesting place. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of work there. Or the United States, the American dream, you know, everything from Oktoberfest to bratwurst to there's so many German things. As a matter of fact, even, I don't want to get into it, like I can't think of it right now, but there's so many things. Sauerkraut, and the impact of, hot dogs, and Frankfurters in Chicago, for example, are very German in their character. Or there's so many things that are German. A lot of the beer that you guys drink, the lager, all that is German style lager. Other drinks are quite different, ale and Pilsner and so on. There's a lot of reasons to celebrate German culture, and we can't say they're Nazis. Germans are not forever Nazis, just like a lot of Soviets and post-Soviet people came to Canada and the United States, and they're members of the society. They might not like Putin, they might not agree with Putin, but they're still human beings, and they're Russians, they're Belarusians, they're, let's say, Latvians, and all these different cultures that are from there. There are people from the stands that are Uzbeks, there are people, Muslims like me, they're Tajiks and this and that, but their fathers were Russian speaking and were Soviets and would not declare their religion on their paperwork. They were just Soviets. Now, are they Soviets forever? No, the living ones, yeah, they'll always be Soviet, because they'll remember that. They'll always remember. I remember working on a T-72 tank. I remember making a Tokarev pistol, or whatever it may be. Same with the Nazi. Colonel Hunka will be like, I'll always remember my youth. I served. That's where I got my military training. And we tried to fight Russia. But then after the war was over and it was said and done, I immigrated with my family to Canada for better prosperity, because it was known back then that Canada had a lot of opportunities. So we have to forgive. We cannot brand people forever. That's the exact thing that I said to a lot of people on my private shows, was that we can't criminalize Jews. Instead, we have to try to learn from their system. Instead of saying it's a conspiracy and this and this and that, learn from the system. How do they do it? What's, kosher? What's not kosher? What is, and that's what's happening. We should never persecute people for who they are. But if they do wrong and they do crimes, we should prosecute them. Everyone should be equally. They have better lawyers. What about that? There's a whole list of things that we can be anti-Semitic about. But what we have to solve today is understand that just because of nationality, now we're going through a world of new nations, okay? You have to be careful not to brand governments or types of governments in such a way that we put them on a list. Now, as far as Iran, there's been many efforts. Iran, the IRGC, there's been many efforts to try and say, why do you guys swim against the stream so hard where you make it impossible for the rest of us? Okay, so that's one of them, for example. Why did you guys do that with Hugo Chavez? Why did you guys do that with, in our neighborhood? Why are you guys messing around with this new, different thing? That's one argument. Russia, Mr. Putin's Russia. Most people don't want Mr. Putin's Russia, but I think Mr. Putin does a great job for his Russians and his own people. I think he is a hero for his people. He's not a hero for us because he keeps taking things that we had separated from him, like Georgia, like, what's it called, Crimea, and like Ukraine. I think he's not always justified to do that, but he has his own justifications, and that's, he's the leader of Russia. He's done a lot of good things for Russia too, and he's brought back a very failed state to a situation where we have to sit with these people and we have to make deals. We have to sit with the Russians, Mr. Putin and his people, and we have to sit down and say, okay, now what's next? We got to end this war. This war is just dragging on, and we can't keep losing all these young, good-hearted, handsome Ukrainian men, to death. There's already a shortage of white people. The numbers are ridiculous. They have no birth rates. They have almost zero birth rates, and the families are broken usually. There's 2 or 3 families, and they don't stay in touch. They don't pay child support. They're not together. There's a big problem. And Nazism isn't the answer. Nazism today is just a salute. It's a symbol. It's an insignia. It's a misunderstanding of what they were trying to accomplish. And in its essence, we have to find a new way to say, no, white nationalism is okay, because they are a new race. If you really look into the United States and Canada, you're going to find out, like I met a lady the other day. Her name was, I can't remember what her name was, but it was usually a Mick, It's a Mick, her name was Manus. I'm like, a girl's name Manus? McManus is a common name. Or was it Man? No, Manus. And she's like, yeah, it is an Irish name, but I'm actually, and she had nothing to do with Ireland except for a grandmother. I think Scandinavian and German is what she said. No, not Ukrainian. Whatever the point was, she's like, just because my name is Manus doesn't mean I'm Irish, but my mom's mom had a brother named Manus, and she named, like, what I'm trying to say is they're a new race. They really are a new race. And that's not just now. This was already happening when my parents were children in the 1950s. So you can imagine today they're third generation down, and they're very mixed, and it's just this new white Christian race, and some of them have Jews intermarried to them too. So my point is, just because a government goes through some bad time in its history, and the people that saluted it, doesn't mean that they're going to be branded for the rest of their lives to have followed that government. And I think Mr. Hunka is just like many Ukrainians. There's so many Ukrainians in Canada. If you come to Western Canada, like Alberta and Saskatchewan, you're going to find a lot of Ukrainian Canadians, and many of them would be considered have coming with a stamp on their paperwork which would have a Nazi symbol at the top of it, but it doesn't mean they were Nazis. It just means they were people. We're all people. Imagine anything, like there's so much experimentation going on in the world today. Russia is no longer Soviet, but they kept some of the Soviet ideals to make their system work, socialist ideals. Communism is over, but some ideas of communism remain. Nazism is over, but there's some ideas maybe of Nazism that remain too, right? Like racial rights, racial differences, but did they exist before Nazism? Yes, they did. Go look at history from all around the world. You're going to find different groups and different cultures and different neighborhoods getting along with different kinds, because we all are unique and different, and sometimes we want to stick with our own, and that's okay. And that's why we have to be careful not to paint everybody with this Nazi brush. And we don't want to scare Jews anymore. I don't want to scare them, because this will never happen. I don't think so. I hope not. I think what happened in Germany in the 1940s, like I said in my previous recording, was a coming together to do the right thing over a prejudice and a hatred and a caste system that existed in white Europe over 1,000 years. I think it was a breakthrough. I think it was a cultural breakthrough that they got together and said, no, you know what? We're not going to stand it. Even the British family, there was one royal that stood with Hitler. 10 said no. Even in our leaders in the United States and in Canada, so many of them were secretly sympathizers of the Nazis. But 10 out of the whatever it was, 2 out of 10 might have said yes, but 8 out of 10 said no. And that's what matters. That's what matters.